Gallatin County, Montana. October 1888. The air was already sharp with the promise of a brutal winter, a promise the wind carried down from the high peaks like a solemn vow. While other settlers were chinking the last gaps in their log cabins and stacking cords of wood 4 feet high, Friedrich Bohm was doing something that made no sense. He was building 2 walls. His cabin looked like a crude wooden box with another, slightly smaller box nested inside, leaving a 2-foot gap all the way around. And into this gap, he wasn't packing moss or wool or sawdust. He was shoveling dirt. Not just any dirt, but a specific clay-heavy soil he dug from the creek bed, mixed with dried prairie grass. Hadley Cobb, a man who had built 37 log cabins across the territory and considered himself a master of the form, stopped his wagon just to watch the spectacle. He was the settlement's undisputed log cabin specialist. "Bohm," he called out, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and contempt. "What in God's name are you building? A root cellar with a roof?" Friedrich, a quiet Saxon immigrant with the methodical movements of a man who measures everything twice, didn't stop his work. He drove a heavy wooden tamper into the wall cavity, compacting the earth fill with a solid, rhythmic thud. "A warm house, Mr. Cobb." Cobb let out a short, barking laugh. "A warm house? You're building a mud hut and boxing it in with perfectly good pine. That dirt will draw damp, rot your timbers from the inside out before the spring thaw. It's foolishness. You'll have a pile of mud and splinters by May." Other men, hauling their own firewood, stopped to listen. They nodded in agreement. The word spread through the valley in a day. The quiet German was building himself a dirt-walled cabin. He was mad. What did this former Saxon military engineer, a man trained in the forgotten science of earthen fortifications, understand about thermal mass and structural dynamics that a whole community of seasoned, practical-minded frontier builders had so dangerously missed? If you want to discover the lost physics that allowed one family to thrive while others fought for their lives, hit that subscribe button. We're about to dig into a piece of forgotten wisdom that is more relevant today than ever. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these old stories travel. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll never look at a simple cabin or a pile of dirt the same way again. Friedrich Bohm was no stranger to cold. He had served as an engineer in the Royal Saxon Army, where he learned that the earth itself was the greatest shield against both cannonballs and the bone-aching chill of a winter siege. He understood that mass was a form of energy storage, and that the ground beneath his feet held more potential for warmth and safety than the tallest tree in the forest. He'd left Saxony for a new life, bringing his wife Wilhelmina and their 2 young children, Eric and Liesel, to the promising expanse of Montana. Their first winter, in 1887, was a lesson in humility. They lived in a standard, single-wall log cabin, built according to the accepted wisdom of the frontier. It was a handsome structure, with tight-fitting saddle notches and thick mud chinking, and it was a thermal disaster. The wind, a relentless, physical presence, found every microscopic crack. It was a constant, icy whisper that stole heat as fast as their small stove could produce it. Wilhelmina spent her days stuffing rags and paper into the gaps, a futile battle against an invisible enemy. The water bucket 6 feet from the fire would freeze solid overnight. The children, Eric and Liesel, slept in their coats, huddled under a mountain of blankets, and still woke with chattering teeth. Friedrich found himself engaged in a desperate, losing war of attrition against the cold. He fed the stove constantly, consuming a staggering 4 cords of wood in just 2 months. He watched the woodpile shrink with a growing sense of dread, realizing it was not just a source of comfort, but the very measure of his family's survival. He observed the physics of the failure with an engineer's eye. The problem wasn't just the drafts. The logs themselves, solid as they were poor insulators. Heat conducted straight through the wood, radiating out into the frigid air. The intense fire in the stove created a powerful convection loop, pulling cold air from the floor, heating it, and sending it straight up to the ceiling, where its warmth was quickly lost through the roof. It was an astonishingly inefficient system. One evening, watching his daughter Liesel's breath fog in the air inside their own home, he made a decision. He would not spend another winter as a victim of the weather. He would build a fortress against the cold, using the principles he knew not from carpentry, but from war. The conventional wisdom of the Montana frontier was built on an abundance of one thing: timber. The log cabin was the pinnacle of local engineering, a symbol of self-reliance carved directly from the wilderness. Hadley Cobb was its high priest. His cabins were works of art, with perfectly scribed joints that required minimal chinking. He used the heartwood of mature lodgepole pines, logs a full 12 inches in diameter. Leland Trask, the local timber broker, supplied him with the best wood in the valley, and together they represented the unquestioned authority on how a man should shelter his family. Yet, every winter, the same story played out in every cabin, including Cobb's own. The battle for warmth was constant and exhausting. The physics of failure were universal. First, there was conduction. A solid pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1.25 per inch. A 12-inch log wall, therefore, had a total R value of roughly R15. This sounded impressive, but it was uniform and unforgiving. Heat flowed through it steadily, a constant drain on the stove's output. There was no storage, no thermal buffer. Second, there was air infiltration. No matter how masterfully Cobb cut his joints, wood expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity. The freeze-thaw cycle worked on the chinking, a mixture of mud, clay, and grass, creating hairline fractures. In a typical 16 by 20 foot cabin, there were over 300 linear feet of these seams. Under the assault of a 50-mile-per-hour wind, these tiny cracks became jets of Arctic air, atomizing the warmth inside. Families were constantly remudding their walls in a desperate attempt to seal the leaks. Third, there was the inefficiency of the heating source. The standard cast iron stove was a radiant heater. It blasted out heat, making the area 2 feet around it unbearably hot, while the corners of the room remained freezing. As soon as the fire died down, this bubble of radiant heat vanished, and the cabin's temperature would plummet by 30 degrees in under an hour. This rapid cycling meant the stove had to be fed around the clock. The cost was measured in sleepless nights and dwindling wood piles. Leland Trask, a man who literally owned a mountain of timber, complained that heating his own spacious, well-built cabin felt like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. The problem wasn't bad craftsmanship. The problem was bad physics. The settlers were building shelters, but they hadn't yet learned how to build thermal machines. Friedrich Bohm began construction in late August, giving himself time for the walls to cure before the first hard frost. His foundation was not the simple stone pier system common in the area. He dug a 2-foot trench and laid a substantial foundation of dry stacked fieldstone wide enough to support the immense weight to come. Upon this, he began erecting his 2 walls. The outer wall was built of rough-hewn, 6-inch pine logs, notched simply. It was functional, designed to be a shield against the elements, not a piece of art. The inner wall, set 24 inches inside the first, was made of carefully planed tongue-and-groove boards, creating a smooth, airtight interior surface. The 2 walls were connected every 4 feet by sturdy wooden ties, forming a rigid, hollow structure. It was during the filling process that the mockery reached its peak. Hadley Cobb made it a point to stop by daily. "I see you're burying your house before the winter does it for you, Bohm," he said one afternoon, leaning against his wagon wheel. I've been thinking on it. That earth is going to settle. You'll have a 2-foot hollow space at the top of your walls by Christmas, a regular superhighway for drafts and vermin. Friedrich paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He pointed with his shovel. I am tamping it, Mr. Cobb, in 6-inch layers. It is compacted to 95% of its maximum density. It will not settle more than half an inch. He spoke with the flat certainty of an engineer stating a known variable. Leland Trask, the timber broker, was concerned about the materials. Friedrich, that much wet earth pressed against raw pine? Cobb is right. You're creating a paradise for mold and rot. You're actively composting your own home. It's a waste of good lumber. The earth is not wet, Bohm corrected patiently. It is damp enough to compact no more. The moisture content is 12%. The sun will bake these walls for another month. By the time the snow flies, they will be dry. The outer wall will keep them dry. He turned back to his work, shoveling the mixture of soil and grass into the cavity. His wife Wilhelmina worked alongside him, hauling buckets, her face set with a determined trust that silenced most direct criticism. The county clerk, Minerva Goss, a woman who dealt in deeds and numbers, calculated the load. Mr. Bohm, by my estimation, those walls will weigh nearly 40 tons. Are you certain your foundation can bear such a load? It seems excessive. Fortifications are heavy, Mrs. Goss, was all he said. He built a custom tamper, a heavy block of oak fitted with a long handle. After each layer was shoveled in, he would spend an hour compacting it, his movements steady and tireless. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed across the small valley, a slow, deliberate heartbeat of defiance against conventional wisdom. The mockery lasted for 6 weeks. The validation would last for a lifetime. To the settlers of Gallatin County, a wall was a barrier. To Friedrich Bohm, a wall was a battery. The science he was employing was centuries old, but new to this land of timber. It rested on 3 fundamental principles of physics the other builders had overlooked. The first and most critical was thermal mass. Wood is a relatively light material. A cubic foot of pine weighs about 28 pounds. The clay-rich earth Bohm was using, when compacted, weighed over 110 pounds per cubic foot. This density is directly related to a material's ability to store heat, a property called specific heat capacity. Water is the baseline at 1.0. Wood is around 0.4. Compacted earth is about 0.2, but its sheer density means that pound for pound, it holds heat far longer. In total, Bohm's walls contained over 700 cubic feet of compacted earth, weighing more than 77,000 pounds. This enormous mass acted as a thermal flywheel. During the day, the small stove didn't have to fight the cold, seeping in from outside. Instead, it poured its energy, measured in British thermal units, or BT-US, into the massive walls. The inner wooden surface would heat up quickly, providing radiant warmth to the room, while the deep earth fill slowly, steadily absorbed the thermal energy hour after hour. When the fire died down at night, the process reversed. The heat stored in those 38 tons of earth began to radiate slowly back into the living space, maintaining a stable temperature. The cabin wasn't being heated by the stove alone. It was being heated by its own walls. The second principle was airtightness. Hadley Cobb's finest cabin was a sieve of tiny cracks. Bohm's wall was, for all practical purposes, a monolithic, 24-inch thick sheet of solid earth. It had no seams, no chinking, no gaps for wind to exploit. The tongue-and-groove inner wall and the rough-hewn outer wall simply contained this perfect, air-impermeable core. The most ferocious wind could beat against the outer logs, but its pressure could not pass through the solid mass. Finally, there was the hidden genius of the title, the only one left standing. This wasn't just about warmth, it was about structural integrity. The double wall structure, with its internal ties, behaved like a massive composite beam. More importantly, the sheer dead weight of the walls anchored the cabin to its foundation with immense force. While a standard log cabin could be subject to uplift forces from extreme winds getting under the eaves, Bohm's cabin was a low, heavy fortress. It was an immovable object, designed not just to shed the wind, but to break it. He hadn't built a house. He had built a bunker. That winter, the sky fell. It began in late January of 1889 with a deceptive mildness, a Chinook wind that melted the top layer of snow. Then the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. The wind swung around to the north, and what came with it was not a storm, but a geological event. It was a blizzard of historic fury, a relentless 3-day assault of wind and ice. The locals would later call it the Great Blow. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It carried ice and gravel that scoured the bark from the windward side of trees. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, and the wind chill was a number no one dared to calculate. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a waking nightmare. In Leland Trask's home, the wind forced its way through the chinking with the power of a fire hose, extinguishing candles and making the stove roar like a blast furnace as it sucked air up the flue. The family huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their world reduced to a small, smoky circle of heat. By the second day, they were burning fence posts. Hadley Cobb's prize cabin, his personal residence, faced the full fury of the gale. Around midnight on the second night, he heard a sound like a pistol shot. A massive gust had found a weak point under the northern eave, lifting the roof structure just enough to break the connection with the gable wall. The top 3 logs on the windward side shifted, tearing a massive, irreparable hole in the structure. Snow and ice blasted into the loft. His fortress of wood had been breached. He and his family retreated to the root cellar, listening to their home being torn apart above them. But inside Friedrich Bohm's dirt-walled cabin, there was silence. The monstrous 80-mile-per-hour wind hammering the outer walls was reduced to a distant, muffled hum. There were no drafts, not a single flicker from the oil lamp on the table. The sheer mass of the walls dampened the vibration and the noise, creating an atmosphere of profound calm. The stove burned with a steady, efficient flame, consuming a fraction of the wood his neighbors were burning. The inner walls were warm to the touch. Wilhelmina cooked a stew, the smell of beef and onions filling the small, warm space. Eric and Liesel played a game on the floor. Their coats and hats hung neatly on pegs. The temperature inside never dropped below 65 degrees. While the world outside was being ripped apart by a force of unimaginable violence, the Bohm family was safe, warm, and at peace. Winter had thrown its worst punch, and the earthen walls hadn't even registered the blow. They simply held the heat, a silent, massive testament to the quiet engineer's defiant wisdom. When the wind finally subsided on the 4th morning, the valley was a landscape of frozen devastation. A deathly silence had replaced the roar. Drifts of snow were piled 20 feet high, sculpting the land into alien shapes. One by one, settlers emerged, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and cold. The damage was catastrophic. 3 barns had been flattened, dozens of livestock had frozen where they stood, and nearly every cabin showed signs of the battle. Hadley Cobb's home was a wreck, the northern wall crippled, the interior filled with snow. His pride as a builder had been shattered along with his timbers. His first instinct was survival, but his second was a burning, desperate curiosity. He had to see what had become of Bohm's mud-walled folly. He bundled himself against the biting cold and began the arduous trek through the deep drifts, expecting to find a collapsed heap of logs in frozen earth. As he approached, the first thing he noticed was the smoke rising from the chimney. Not a frantic, desperate plume, but a thin, lazy wisp, as if from a casual morning fire. The cabin stood perfectly intact, seemingly untouched, a low, solid block against the white chaos. He reached the door and hesitated, then knocked. Friedrich Bohm opened it. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Cobb saw Wilhelmina clearing away breakfast dishes. The air that flowed out of the doorway wasn't the frigid, smoky air of a cabin that had barely survived the night. It was a wave of calm, steady, clean warmth. It was the air of a normal home on a normal day. Cobb was speechless. He stepped inside, and the feeling was surreal. His ears, ringing from the memory of the wind, were met with a profound quiet. He looked at the smooth, planed walls. He reached out a hand, his fingers numb with cold, and laid it flat against the wood. It was warm. Not hot, not cold, just warm. A deep, gentle, radiant warmth. He turned to Bohm, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "How?" was all he could manage. Just then the door opened again. It was Leland Trask, his face covered in frost, his eyes hollow. "Friedrich," he began, his voice cracking, "we are out of wood. My wife, the children—" "Bring them," Bohm said simply, his voice devoid of triumph. "There is room. There is warmth." Trask brought his shivering family inside, and the scene repeated itself. The shock of the warmth, the disbelief, the slow realization that they had stepped into a different reality. Hadley Cobb, the master builder, walked the perimeter of the small room, touching the walls again and again. He looked at the small, calmly burning stove, then back at the massive walls. The pieces clicked into place in his mind, rearranging his entire understanding of his craft. "It's not the stove heating the room," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice was filled with awe. "The stove heats the walls. The walls heat the room." He looked at Friedrich Bohm, the man he had openly mocked for months. "It's not a wall. It's a storage stove. You've built a house that is also a fireplace." Friedrich simply nodded. "It holds the heat." The story of the great blow of '89 and Bohm's fortress cabin became the defining legend of that winter. Survival on the frontier was the ultimate arbiter of truth, and the evidence was undeniable. While others were rebuilding, Friedrich Bohm was simply living. The mockery that had once echoed through the valley was replaced by a quiet, profound respect. Hadley Cobb, humbled and transformed, became Bohm's greatest advocate. He spent a week with Friedrich, not as a master but as an apprentice, armed with a notepad and an open mind. He learned about soil composition, moisture content, and the critical importance of compaction. He abandoned the pride he'd taken in fancy joinery and embraced the brutal, effective elegance of mass. That spring, he didn't just repair his cabin, he rebuilt it using Bohm's principles, erecting a second wall inside the first and filling the cavity with tons of carefully prepared earth. He started calling the technique Bohm wall construction, and he gave Friedrich full credit every time. Leland Trask, seeing the future, began offering loads of prime clay fill alongside his timber deliveries. The idea spread not through books or newspapers, but through first-hand experience. A neighbor would visit Bohm's cabin on a cold day and leave a convert. By the autumn of 1889, 7 new homes in the valley were being built or retrofitted with the double-wall, earth-filled method. The following winter, the results were staggering. Families reported using less than half the firewood they had previously, some claiming fuel savings as high as 60%. The constant, exhausting work of feeding the stove around the clock was replaced by a simple routine of a hot fire in the morning and another in the evening. The walls did the rest. The idea was too practical, too effective to be ignored. It became the new standard for anyone serious about surviving a Montana winter. It would be easy to dismiss this as a primitive solution born of necessity, a relic of a bygone era. But that would be a profound mistake. Friedrich Bohm, with his Saxon engineering training and his simple materials, was not looking backward. He was a century ahead of his time. The principles he deployed are the very cornerstones of modern high-performance building science. His double-wall structure is the direct ancestor of the double-stud wall construction used in today's most energy-efficient homes. Builders now fill that cavity not with dirt, but with dense-packed cellulose or mineral wool. But the principle of creating a thick, thermally broken wall assembly is identical. His focus on a monolithic, airtight core anticipated the modern obsession with air sealing. Building scientists today use blower doors to measure a home's air tightness in air changes per hour. Bohm achieved near-perfect air tightness with 38 tons of dirt. The outer log wall, which protected the earthen core from rain and snow, is what modern architects call a rain screen facade. It's a cutting-edge technique for managing moisture in high-performance walls, separating the weather-resisting layer from the insulated layer. And most importantly, his use of thermal mass is a central concept in passive solar design. Modern eco-homes use concrete floors, stone walls, and phase-change materials to do exactly what Bohm's dirt walls did: absorb heat when it's available and release it slowly when it's needed. He had built, in essence, a passive house, a structure that works intelligently with the laws of physics rather than fighting a brute force